This is Tyler O'Neill with the Daily Signal live at the Republican National Convention. I'm honored to be joined by Meg Basham, who's a culture reporter at the Daily Wire and author of the really monumental book, Shepherds for Sale. Meg, it's so great to have you.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here, especially in this venue. This is exciting.
Yeah, no, I mean, this whole convention has been quite energizing, and I just want to, jump right into your book, which I find extremely important these days. We've long seen this movement among evangelical churches, and I mean, I think it's happening in Catholic churches too, but where you see these churches suddenly start adopting the world's view of sexuality, particularly on LGBTQ issues, and all these things that go directly against what Scripture clearly says. And that's not that we hate or look down on or have any sort of animus against people.
We've all got our such were some of us sins. Yeah.
Right, exactly. But that God clearly says, homosexuality is, in the words of the Catholic Church, disordered, but also, a curse in Romans 1. And so, where have you seen this movement? What led you to investigate it? And then what did you find?
Well, that was really only one piece of the puzzle when I started working on this topic. It started back for like a lot of people in 2019, 2020, when you saw the racial rhetoric. Suddenly you saw racial grievance being pushed into the churches, into the seminaries, and you went, wow, this doesn't feel biblical. Where's this coming from? And those little alarm bells started sounding really loud when we got into COVID. And suddenly things that should have been, very much personal conscience issues, like should I get vaccinated? These were peddled from pulpits as you must get vaccinated in order to follow Jesus, a personal health decision. I mean, that was really bizarre. And what we found out was that National Institutes of Health Director Francis Collins, otherwise known as Anthony Fauci's boss, was partnering with these ministries intentionally to say, how do we get the Christians to fall in line with these authoritarian policies? So that's what really started me investigating it. But what I found at that point was that the left-wing infiltration, very deliberate infiltration in the form of secular foundations funded by people like George Soros, Bill Gates, the Clinton Foundation, that they were deliberately infiltrating churches and ministries, creating evangelical front groups to move evangelicals on any number of policy prescriptions. For instance, something like the Equality for All Act, which the Heritage Foundation and many other foundations stood against as being a threat to religious liberty. Well, so much of that was being pushed through churches and Christian organizations through these left-wing foundations.
Yeah. And we talk about this Christian nationalist rhetoric, where if you don't toe the party line that they're pushing, by these foundations, you're evil, you're, Trumpist,
Right.
You're totalitarian, you're all these things. And it's just like, well, as a Christian, I believe, certain things that are grounded on biblical truth. And it just so happens that they often correspond to conservative political stances, but they don't have to. And it's not like I am a Christian because I'm conservative. Rather, more the other way around.
Yeah, and so much of what we're seeing is this reframing a very normal and long historical trend of Christians living out their faith in the public sphere, using the same levers of constitutional power that the secular left does, and suddenly christening that as something scary and giving it the name Christian nationalism. So to give you just one example, we saw the Rob Reiner documentary. It was terrible. It was the anti-Christian nationalism documentary, God and Country. And it said that the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade was a symptom of Christian nationalism. Well, let's think about how that happened. Essentially, all you saw were Christians over a period of 50 years making use of the same legislative process, the same electoral process, the same judicial process that their secular left neighbors do. And that's now been christened Christian nationalism. And because of that, they have suggested that that is something threatening and violent. And I think that it is impossible not to look at that rhetoric and look at what happened Saturday and start to make connections about how dangerous it is to suggest that people who have religious convictions, and that very naturally develops into a policy view, that is somehow dangerous. Well, I would say it's actually dangerous to peddle that view, which we saw the day before President Trump was shot. The Washington Post had not an op-ed, but supposedly a piece of reporting on the danger of the violent rhetoric of Christian nationalism. And it was really, I don't know how else to put it, but it was like vibes. They didn't have specific quotes, they didn't have specific allegations. It was just this idea, the fact that Christians want to take part in our electoral process is somehow dangerous.
Well, I think it echoes, we've seen the left likes to say, look, we have January 6th, look, we have the Paul Pelosi attack. And it's like, those are bad examples.
Correct.
But at the same time, we also saw Steve Scalise nearly lose his life at the congressional baseball game practice. And we saw the Family Research Council nearly get shot up by a gunman who was using a map published by this group called the Southern Poverty Law Center to target anti-LGBTQ plus hate groups.
And our Supreme Court justices, let's not forget about that. We've seen very specific threats against them, against their lives. And that story was almost entirely covered up. So, when I think about those things, part of what I consider is that January 6th, there's a very tenuous argument to say that January 6th, in terms of not the regular people who were there to demonstrate, which they had every constitutional right to do, but the people who broke into the Capitol, there's really very little evidence that those people were motivated by any kind of serious faith. So, I don't think that the shaman in his headdress statement really has a deep biblical understanding of what's motivating his policy preferences. So, that's a stretch. And I think you can kind of say that. Same thing with the Paul Pelosi attack. There is certainly no evidence whatsoever that that man was in any way motivated by any sort of religious belief. So all of this is, I think you can say, it's sheer bigotry. It's sheer bigotry against Christians.
Yeah. Where do you see that coming from? You mentioned these funders. Are they connected at all? They're pushing in the churches, but are they also pushing this narrative elsewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you look at someone like Russell Moore, who is the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, he's been very outspoken, kind of joining the left in warning against Christian nationalism. Well, one thing I can tell you is that Russell Moore, we don't know why, but in 2016, when DC Leaks happened and the board books of George Soros' foundation Open Society leaked, we know that Russell Moore was listed as a grantee in those documents. We also know he's heavily involved with the Evangelical Immigration Table, which is legally housed under the National Immigration Forum, which is a major beneficiary of George Soros funding and has been for a number of years. So, yes, there are connections there.
Yeah. And I find, like the Southern Poverty Law Centers received grants from the Open Society Foundation.
So you know all about this.
And from like the Tides Foundation.
Yep.
And
Rockefeller.
All of these. You can name
Hewlett,
one after another.
all the usual
Arabella
suspects.
Advisors. Yeah. Where do you see this nefarious campaign going? Are they, I think they've been exposed by your book. They've been exposed by Scott Walters' fantastic book about Arabella. Are they becoming more secretive now, or are they just throwing caution to the winds?
Excuse me. Well, I mean, from my perspective, one thing I can tell you is they're definitely becoming more litigious and threatening. I've received a few cease and desist letters while working on my book saying, we want you to stop talking about this. And, when my lawyers return fire and go, here's all the documentation, they get kind of quiet, and then they go bother somebody else who, printed something about my book, and they try to get them to take it down. So I would say they're making efforts to try to suppress this information. I don't think that's going to work, because I think we've reached a tipping point where, the general, particularly conservative public, is so very aware of how this money is moving. And there's a very big difference to me between, say, George Soros or Pierre Omidyar of eBay, who is a Buddhist, funding Christian organizations, because neither of those gentlemen are Christian by any stretch of the imagination, nor do they claim to be, nor do any of their convictions really align with biblical principle. So they have to be covert in what they're doing. And that's very different from something like, say, the Christian Coalition, which is very out in the open about what its aims are and who's funding it and what its interests are, because it doesn't have to hide. So, sometimes people ask me, well, do you cover what's happening on the right? I have some criticism there, but it's a very different animal because what they're doing is transparent. What George Soros is doing, they work very hard to hide it, and they work very hard to make people who might expose it feel afraid to do so.
Have you been, this is one of my favorite things, have you been criticized as being anti-Semitic because you talk about George Soros's funding?
A couple of times, but I feel like maybe that's not really as effective as it used to be. I've had people on Twitter sort of fling it at me, and I just laugh that off because, look, I love my boss, Ben Shapiro. I'm hardly anti-Semitic. So, in fact, sometimes I have real anti-Semites attack me because I work at the Daily Wire and I love working at the Daily Wire. And so, look, I know what real anti-Semitism looks like, and it's come after us plenty of times. But simply being opposed to a left-wing atheist Jew, I think it's important to point out, is, that's like saying if you attack someone who has red hair, you're anti-red hair people. Well, that's not obviously the case. It's just he happens to be doing nefarious things.
Right. Where do you see that money intersecting with the Democratic Party or with policy that we've seen from the Biden administration?
Well, essentially what you're seeing is there was very much an awareness in 2016 that evangelical voter is what put President Trump over the top. And in 2020, there was a mobilized effort to try to either suppress or co-opt that vote. It was very deliberate. There was groups called Evangelicals for Biden. There was a political action committee called Not Our Faith. And so these groups were kind of welcomed in, not just to the left-wing religious atmosphere that you might expect, like, say, a Sojourners or groups that you kind of know are on the religious left, but they were welcomed in by a Christianity Today, which most people still kind of think of as mainstream evangelicalism, the magazine founded by Billy Graham in 1953, the Gospel Coalition. So I think people were maybe not aware that those efforts were being made, and they didn't recognize it when it was happening, that those were attempts to capture that voter in order to blunt the impact of evangelicals in politics generally, because whatever else you want to say about them, it is still very true that they are a force in politics. They are absolutely the most important voting bloc to the GOP. So I don't think you can get away from that, and that is why so much effort was made to capture them.
So you recently went to the Southern Baptist Convention.
I did.
And I heard that there was a lot of news you made there.
Well, I gave a speech, and really what I went there to do was to let Southern Baptists know, and for those who are not Southern Baptists and may not know, why do I care about the Southern Baptists? They are America's largest Protestant denomination by a long shot. Their seminaries educate a plurality of pastors in all Protestant denominations. They, in fact, represent about 5% of the American population. So if you are trying to move evangelicals, you're especially going to target Southern Baptists because you can get a lot of bang for your buck out of them. And so what I really wanted to do was reveal how some Southern Baptist organizations are being co-opted and how they are teaching things through their seminaries, how they are promoting things through their lobbying arm that the average Southern Baptist wouldn't necessarily agree with, things like gun control or climate change legislation, and that in a lot of ways that is being done through the efforts of these left-wing foundations.
Yeah. Well, Meg, thank you so much for your important work exposing this movement. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close?
Just that I really only covered the tip of the iceberg in this book, and what I wanted to offer people was sort of a representative explanation of what's happening so that they understand it when it comes into their church, their kids' Christian college, and can recognize it. So it's far from exhaustive, but at least it gets the ball rolling and waking people up to what's going on in evangelical churches.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Meg. Again, this is Tyler O'Neill reporting live at the Republican National Convention, and we'll see you in the next one.